And um, okay, so ignore that, please. Basically, we're going to start with the individual and the group, and I'm going to cover this part, and then Yun is going to cover about um, culture and culture related stuff, and then I'm going to cover the HL content. Alright, so um, like the syllabus, we're going to cover social identity theory, social cognitive theory, stereotypes, and um, conformity, which actually would be covered later in the cognition, in the culture and cognition section, because we forgot to remove and change that. I am sorry. And now we're going to go into social identity theory by Tatchell and Turner in 1979. So according to this theory, there are two different types of self, which is the social identity and the personal identity. So the social identity refers to our identity in terms of um, our gender, our ethnicity, basically what people see or what people think of when they see you physically. However, personal identity, on the other hand, would be your identity as an individual, as a private, interpersonal level. Usually, examples of this would be something like your personality, um, what you like and what you dislike, relating with cognition related things. So, um, the social identity theory is based on social categorization, which means that um, your identity is perceived through the classification of people based on their similar characteristics or traits. And um, there are three assumptions in the social identity theory. The first would be that um, in the theory, it is assumed that individuals strive to maintain or enhance their self esteem. So they have a positive self concept. And they also assume that memberships to social groups have positive and negative associations. So um, their identity have a prominence or an effect to the group. The third assumption that they have would be that their member values their in-group to social comparison with out-groups. So um, through this comparison, if they think that their in-group has more positive values, that means that they would believe that their group has more positive identities, and it will also further enhance their own self-esteem because they believe that um, like their group's concept have a positive concept and it gives an impact to their own self, individual self. And however, if an individual is not happy with their group, or if they think that they perceive more negative associations in their in groups, then there's a likelihood that they might have increased permeability, which means that they have an increased ability to move between groups with flexible boundaries. You see this when you have like this certain group of friend or this certain friend who usually like um, have a lot of friends or have a lot of friends in a way like they would just jump into one group to another group. And however, if they have a negative association to the group they're in, but the boundaries are impermeable. So impermeable as if they don't really have the ability to flexibly move from one group of friend to another group of friend or one group to another um, trait. Like for example, like gender, um, you can't immediately change flexibly. it takes time. They may try to make their group more positive and discriminate out groups as a result of coping with that. So, one study that supports this that you can use would be by Tatchville et al. In 1971. And slight note, in group means our group and out group means their group. It's actually pretty self-explanatory, but I guess I'll explain it a little. And so, as you can see in this flowchart, it shows like the process of how the social identity theory works. So from personal identity into social identity through social categorization, and then this creates this in-group and out-group division. And with this comparison, it can affect our the individual's personal social identity, either positive or negatively, and it may or not enhance their self-esteem, which may or not affects their self-concept. So next, we're going into social cognitive theory. So social cognitive theory is a theory that was proposed by Bandura, and according to this theory, it is assumed that people learn by watching and imitating the behavior. So another term for this would be observational learning. And according to this theory, there's this thing called vicarious reinforcement. So basically, what this is that there's a tendency for humans or for individuals to replicate the behaviors that are rewarded or perhaps perceived as rewarding. And there are several factors of social cognitive theories. So the first factor would be attention, and then retention, motivation, and potential. So someone's attractiveness or authoritarian attitude or the desirability of the model that provides the learning behavior or gives the learning behavior determines how likely this observer, this individual, would replicate that behavior. And and then the next factor would be retention. So some behaviors may be too complex. However, for other behaviors, some of the behavior may be simpler for people to remember and to produce. And so this may influence the tendency of someone to replicate this particular behavior. And I like to like pause my revision session because I just realized the screen sharing is sharing like the wrong screen. I am very sorry. Wait, let me share the correct screen that I'm supposed to be sharing. Alright, there. Have I sent the link to the presentation? I haven't. Okay, I'll send it while we're at it. Alright, so that's the link to the presentation if you guys prefer to look at the presentation. Alright, so let's continue. So, another factor is motivation. An individual should have to want to replicate a behavior. An individual must have a motivation, and that means that they should have some thought about the potential outcomes when they replicate this behavior. This can actually link back to the theory of recent behavior or theory theory of planned behavior, theory of recent action. And the next one would be potential. So basically, this relates to individual self-esteem or self-efficacy. And um, an individual, in order for them to be able to successfully replicate a behavior or at least replicate a behavior, they should be at least physically or mentally capable, or they should at least have a belief that they would be successful in replicating a behavior. Also, in response to Yoon, we're in slide 10. All right, so the next part about social cognitive theory is that there are also more factors that influences observers or individuals or not to replicate the study. So um, three of three of these would be the consistency. So if a model behaves consistently across situations, so um, they don't contradict their own behavior because, as you may know, humans tend to prefer um, people or individuals who does things consistently. There would be a higher likelihood for people to replicate the study. Wait, sorry, to replicate the behavior that the model does. And then another factor would be identification with the model. So if a model is similar by trait or by characteristics, for example, by their gender, um, by maybe ethnicity, there would be a higher tendency to imitate the models because of how you can, because of how the individuals can relate to the model. There's also the factor of liking the model. If you compare um, a model that's warm and friendly versus a model that's cold and unlikable, then there would be a higher likelihood for the observer to replicate the warm and friendly model's behavior. So, one study that we can use in support of this theory would be Bandura et al. In 1961. Um, Also, side note, I'm pretty sure there are more studies than the studies I mentioned beforehand. However, the studies I mentioned beforehand were merely examples of the studies that you can use. And if you have your own studies, feel free to use them as long as it relates back to the theory. Because, um, as you may know, in IB psychology, there's a lot of studies that you can use, but the studies the studies that I'm setting as an example are just taken from the IB Psychology book or the In Thinking's website. Right, so let's continue to stereotypes. So, um, what is a stereotype? Stereotype is a social perception of an individual of their in group or their attributes. And so, it's like a generalization made of a group and their members. And Tetchville argues that this is a natural cognitive process of social categorization. And what this means is that Tetchville believes that it's a justified process, a natural process done by our mind or our cognitive process to categorize people socially. There are a lot of arguments on how stereotypes may be formed, And here are some of them. The first was by Snyder or however you say it, in 2004. So Snyder, Schneider believes that there are two ways that stereotypes are developed: indirectly and directly. So indirect ways of the development of a stereotype would be um, through products of culture and society, or directly would be as a result of our own experience or our individual's experience with people. This is actually quite similar to the idea proposed by Camp, Campbell in 1967, um, which is someone's personal experience with individual and groups, and the gatekeepers, or um, through culture or society, which is the media, our parents, or other cultural members that we look up to. So, um, however, Campbell further argues that stereotypes have some basis in reality, and um, also proposed a hypothesis which is called grain of truth hypothesis. So, Campbell believes that the experience that an individual group has would be generalized um, through like certain traits that they have. But then there's also someone called proposed by Hamilton and Gifford in 1976. Sorry, 1976. Um, this also have connections with cognitive approach, and they argued that stereotypes is a result of illusory correlation. Um, so, what illusory correlation means briefly is that um, when there are two things that are not connected, by fact, not connected at all, humans would try to make a pattern that connects both of these things. And I wouldn't explain further because this is supposed to be in cognitive approach, and I've explained about it. But one study that supports this would be Hamilton and Gifford in 1976. So stereotypes have effects, and um, the reason why they have these effects is because, um, as you can see, um, schema is something you learn in cognitive psychology, cognitive approach in psychology, and it is believed that schema have an effect on behavior. And if you have reviewed or learned cognitive approach in psychology, we've also learned that stereotyping is a form of schema processing. So, um, stereotyping can affect people's behavior. And when we explore in psychology, there are two things that can become the side effects of stereotyping, which is the stereotype threat and memory distortion. So, stereotype that happens when an individual is in a situation where threat is being um, judged or treated stereotypically, and um, the fear of doing it confirms the stereotype. So, a study that supports this would be a study by Steele and Aronson in 1995 about the stereotype threat, which turns on the spotlight anxiety. So, spotlight anxiety is an emotional distress or pressure that may undermine people's performance. And basically, stereotype threat overall means that um, when an individual is like viewed stereotypically, stereotypically um, they they might be afraid of doing something that confirms the stereotype. So they might actually accidentally do the stereotype due to their fear in their mind. In another study which supports this would be Spencer et al. In 1999 about stereotype threat on intellectual performance. So, the next side effect of stereotypes would be memory distortion. So, um, stereotyping affect perception can put implication in memory. So, like in cognitive approach, we learned that schema can distort memory, and schema is a schema has a lens that can filter your memory and affect how you perceive your memory. And in this case, stereotyping can also do the same thing because um, stereotyping can form as a lens to filter out your perception of the memory that you experience. So, a study that supports this would be by Martin and Halvorsen in 1983 about gender stereotype on kids' memory recall. Right. So we are now going into cultural origins of behavior and cognition, and this is going to be explained by Yoon. So
So I will present on the cultural origins of behavior and cognition, which is the next part of the sociocultural thing. And basically, what this entails is they have two different sections that they go into, which is culture and its influence on behavior and cognition, and the cultural dimensions. And then there's also a bit on conformity that you need to know, which actually goes on throughout sociocultural part, but they begin mentioning it in more detail in this section. So, um, the first thing that they look at is the whole idea of defining what culture is, and there's many definitions, but the one that cognitive provides, and I think it's pretty good, is that it's a set of attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by a group of people, but it's different for each individual and is communicated from one generation to the next. So it's based on Matsumoto's study that he did in 1996. And if you were to sum it up, it's just saying cultural norms and values that are communicated through socialization of children into a more culturally acceptable way of behaving. And then important terms that are highlighted often. There are different terms for culture, like there's subcultures and other cultures that fall under the whole idea. And one of them, like a few of them, are surface culture, which is culture that you can observe from the outside. And that's mainly languages, the style of dress of people. And then deep culture is culture that cannot necessarily be observed. So it's often people who are members of that culture who seem to know of it better than, say, an outsider. And they tend to be the values and beliefs of the people and their thought processes. Um, and then the last term that you need to know is cultural norms, which is the standards, expectations, rules that guide behavior within cultural groups. And they're often learned from parents, teachers, peers within the same culture. Um, I know that for my teacher, the way she explains surface culture and deep culture is like an iceberg, wherein the surface of the iceberg is what you see, and then deep culture is the stuff beneath that only, like, say, the iceberg knows. So unless you look deeper and talk to the people, you don't necessarily know what deep culture is. That effort. We started this yesterday. But okay. Um, so the first thing that we'll look at is how cultural origins are related to the whole idea of conformity. And I do know that Chelsea's going to go over this part. Yes? No? Chelsea? Or not? Okay. Um, so are you going over conformity or? Yeah, okay. Go. Okay. So the ashes paradigm is basically his study goes over several amounts of years because he tries it in various countries, I think. And then the general idea is that it's a pressure from he wanted to see if pressure from majority causes conformity in a certain group of people. And the task that he uses, which many other researchers use in their studies later on, is the line judgment task. And basically, in general, the line judgment task is when they'll give you a line, they'll give you another set of lines, and then the participant has to pick the line that is closest to that size. And what Ash did in his study is that he put a group of people. There was only one participant that was the actual participant, but the others were just recruited to pretend to be participants as well. And they were instructed to give the wrong answers. And then the participant, the one that they're studying, would observe if they would follow the majority and choose a wrong answer even when they know the right answer, or would they go against it. And that's how they would determine how conformity works. Um, and basically, this task has been used so many times that there is a study done by Smith and Bond that actually does a meta-analysis of 133 studies that use the same task to see how effective the whole idea that Ash had gone around. Um, and what they were able to find is that while they noticed conformity, Ash did not particularly consider culture's influence entirely on conformity. Um, and they noticed that a lot of the collectivist cultures were more likely to conform to the Eastern. So collectivist cultures were more likely to conform. So like the Eastern Asian studies, but then individualist cultures were less likely to conform, and they were most likely usually Western studies. So that's Ash's paradigm. And then the next thing we'll go into is cultural origins and memory. So this looks mainly at the whole idea of cognition and even emotion. I'm going to go shortly over this because there's not too much emphasis on it, but it's good to know. And when they talk about cultural origins and memory, there's also a connection to the cognitive part that you should have probably done, which is, for example, if you've done the war story, the one about American Indians, it's Bartlett's 1920 and 1932 study, where they talk about cultural schemas and how that influences how well you would remember a story from a completely different culture. Or you have Brown and Kulik, wherein they look at specific people from specific culture and how that would influence how well they remember flashbulb memory, so emotional memories. Um, and other areas that they often look at is autobiographical memory and the earliest memories of people, where your culture and depending where you're from, you would remember different moments in your life in either more detail or you would have more emotions in that sense. And yeah, entropy suggested Kulkowski. I don't know that study, but there are many studies you can go into, but I won't give you specific ones because that depends on your school, and you can always think, oh, okay, I don't use in thinking of it. It's pretty cool. I use Cognity and course companions. So, the next thing, which will be culture's effect on intuitive thinking, where the idea is that culture influences how one influence thinking styles of people. And there is this one study that actually is brought up a lot of times, even in the other section of sociocultural, which is Noren Zion et al., where they were trying to see if Western thinking was more different, so they were more rule governed, and less intuitive than, say, East Asians. And their whole idea was based on the fact that Westerners are more, well, East Asians are encouraged to think in a more intuitive way because of the Taoist influence, and then Western thinking being more rule governed because of their religion. So that is cultural intuitive thinking. And now I will go into the other part, which is cultural dimensions. And basically, cultural dimensions is circled around this in really big study done by Hofstede, which is they developed this theory that cultural dimensions shape behavior. So, cultural dimensions are things that shape the behavior of whole cultures. And the whole idea of this was to provide this general framework to make it easier to understand interpersonal and intergroup interactions. So, for example, if you were thinking of running a company in another country, knowing these dimensions would be a way for you to respect that person's culture. So, if suppose you were going to Japan and they are more work oriented, or there's, I don't remember the exact dimension, but you would be careful as to how you structure the way your office is made, or the way how long the working hours are based on that dimension which you use as a like framework for you. um and then there are many dimensions that Hofstede came up with in his study. And the first four are the ones he came up with first, and then the next two, long term, short term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. Those two were put in much later on. But the first four are the ones that are more like what he started off with. And I will mainly go into individualism and collectivism. There is information on long term and short term, but there is quite a lot of studies done on the whole individualism and collectivism. So I will go more in depth into those two for this presentation. So, individualism and collectivism. Individualism is the countries or cultures that are individualistic tend to value independence, self-reliance, and they are more likely to celebrate their individual achievements. So the focus. So it's not just I and we all the time. I mean, if you're trying to remember the difference, individualism, bleh, individualism is I, collectivism is we. But the best way to think about it is that their focus, one of them focuses on the individual and the other focuses on the group. So in individualism, the focus is on the individual, and examples of this tend to be the United States, UK, and Australia. And collectivism is more about group harmony, and the group has more importance over the individual. So when you're celebrating an achievement, the individual achievement would be kind of celebrated as a group one. So an example of that is, say somebody got into university. But in a collectivist culture, they would give credit not only to the person who got into university, but to the parents, to the teachers, to the people who supported this student to get to that university in that sense. So they would celebrate it with everyone, which kind of sucks, I guess, but that's kind of how collectivist cultures work. Oh, yay. It's helpful. Okay. So, I will look into one specific study that I covered in class, but it it's a really nice study if you ever want to try it, and you can use it for other sections as well. So it's by Berry 1967, which is on conformity and cultural dimensions. And what this study looked at was the rates of conformity in individualistic and collectivist cultures. So they chose two different cultures. One is the Temne people of Sierra Leone, who were collectivist, mainly collectivist people, and then the Inuits of Canada, where it was more individualistic culture. And they used the Ashes paradigm on both groups to see if there was a difference in the rate of conformity. And they found that there was a higher rate of conformity in the collectivist culture, um, which was the Temne people, and hence they were able to say, oh, there is an effect of a culture on conformity in this sense, in terms of the which kind of dimension it is from. But then Barry also suggested that there was economy that was a possible factor that influenced how they thought, because Inuits, like, in terms of their economy, they can do a lot of their things alone. They don't necessarily need people to go fishing or kayaking and hunting. They can fend for themselves, basically. And then the Tammany people, because of where they're from, they know that you need lots of people to irrigate fields, share plows. So in that sense, they are naturally collectivist. So they would think more for the group in that sense. Um, but you have to remember that they're just focusing on two cultures and making a generalization. So it is narrowed down. So you can't necessarily generalize it to the entire population when you think about this study. But yes. Oof, cultural dimensions. Okay. I hope this helps you in the future. Because sociocultural, not many people really like it. Like, I personally do not like this, but it is fun to do. So, the next thing that we'll go into is arguments against Hofstede's dimensions. They're not necessarily different studies, but more suggesting other reasons for behavior compared to what Hofstede is saying. So Matsumoto, the guy who defined culture, says that culture is just as much an individual thing as it is social. So research should not necessarily only focus on the outside part, but try and go into both sides. So they're saying you should go in the EMIC and EDIC approach. I will go over these two again, but EMIC is going into how the individual is behaving, so the inside view, and ETIC is more from the outside view at a universal larger group behavior. And he also said to avoid stereotyping a culture's behavior and dismissing individual level and not and don't dismiss individual level investigation. So a lot of studies would assume that the people from the entire culture are all collectivist or individualist, and that dismisses the fact that each person might not necessarily have, say, collectivist behavior. So, and the next argument is Average from, I didn't probably butcher that name, but 1998, um, where it's saying that people are members of different dynamic cultures, and many of them. So dimensions cannot be applied in one way. Like, one person could be from a certain country, but they are also part of other cultures, so they might not necessarily behave what everyone would assume. So it relates to Matsumoto, where you're stereotyping, and you shouldn't necessarily do that. Um, and that is why he's saying no population can be categorized as a single culture or type. So these were the arguments that said that the dimensions aren't necessarily the best when you're trying to understand a culture or research a culture and its behaviors. But Hofstede does have its ways in giving ideas with the dimensions. Okay. And then lastly, I'm going to go into this for this section. I don't have it for the next section, but they're similar. Where if you have an SAQ question, I think it's probably an SAQ or ERQ. I don't remember. But it's the approaches to research. If they ask you a question on research methods, these are some of the few common methods that they use if you want to go into this, which is, well, not want to, but if they ask a question on research methods, you can consider talking about using meta-analysis of previous research. So Smith and Bond did a meta-analysis, and if you use that study, you can talk about how they use meta-analysis to be critical of a specific theory, which is Ash's paradigm, for example. And then Hofstede did a large-scale survey, so you can look at that research method. And Ash did a lab experiment. So when they ask you, say, how approaches to research for the sociocultural approach or to specifically cultural dimensions, or culture and origins of behavior, you can talk about any of these three research methods. There's many others, but these are just a few that are common. Um, or you can overlap them with other questions so you don't have to memorize a lot when the time comes for you to study for the exams. And then ethical considerations, if you have questions on ethics in this specific area, you can think about confidentiality when it comes to large scale data, informed consent when it comes to observations, which is often always, especially with, I think it's covert observations. I don't know if I can use it, but covert observations where they deceive, so they don't necessarily always get informed consent of people, and that is against. It is not taking ethics into account in that sense. And lab experiments as well. And then you can talk about deception, and you can even talk about undue harm, especially with Ash, because they recorded that a lot of the participants later on reflected that I felt stressed or anxious when answering in this conformity situation. So you can talk about these ethical considerations if there's an ethic question in this area. Okay, so yeah, covert observation, whenever that comes out, you can talk about lack of informed consent, especially when they don't know. Yes. Oh, it's been a while. Okay. And the next part we're going to go into is another section, which is cultural influences on individual attitudes, identity, and behavior. So um, these are very related to the previous topic, but more focused on culture in terms of enculturation and acculturation. They can be confusing, so I will try my best to make it simple to understand. Okay. Uh. Okay. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is terms that you need to know. These are just perspectives that you can think of, which they sometimes bring up, which is the universalist or relative perspectives. And when you talk about a universalist perspective, they're talking about all cultures. Relativist perspectives are looking at specific cultures only, and they believe that you have to look specifically and not necessarily generally. And then this was brought up earlier. So emic and etic perspectives are basically emic is you get the insider perspective, so from the individuals of the culture within the group. And then etic perspectives are the outsider perspective. So they're looking across lots of cultures. So examples, the emic perspective is Barry's study, which was attempting in the Inuit people for collectivism and individualism. And then Hofstede was looking at cultures all around the world to kind of get an idea of setting his cultural dimensions. So, talking is tiring. So, enculturation is the first thing that I will go into. I think, yeah, no, I don't think I can find an easier way to differentiate besides knowing the general idea. So, enculturation is basically the process of learning behaviors, characteristics, and norms from the culture you belong to. So, it starts a little after birth when your parents are teaching you stuff. So, you take in stuff from how you're growing up. And it is similar to socialization, but there's a difference. So, socialization is a little more specific than enculturation, I think. Enculturation is more generalized. So, an example of socialization would be, say, at your school, they're like, you have to dress this way, you have to be punctual, you have to, it's not like the social acceptability of copying homework is not necessarily the best. So, that is socialization, but enculturation is more general. So, one of the ways is, say, parenting style. So, how your parents raise you and the beliefs that they will not enforce, but share with you in child development. So, the implications, the connections, there's lots of connections from the cognitive approach that come in, plus some things mentioned earlier. with enculturation, which is social identity theory, conformity, social cognitive theory, memory, and thinking. And I'm using those abbreviations because I couldn't be bothered to type it. So, first thing we'll look at is social identity theory and enculturation. So, the thing that you need to know well is that so firstly, social identity theory is like it theorizes that there's different stages to developing your identity. So there's social categorization, social identification, social comparison, and positive distinctiveness. And enculturation comes in this picture with the influence on categorization and identification. So these two stages where it kind of influences how things go. Basically, these two spaces are where individuals figure out which group they belong to, and then they eventually identify with it. So, enculturation, your parents, the beliefs, and the way they talk to you, where you are, where you're growing up, is basically enculturation, and that is influencing how you are. So, say, I'm using the example from Cognity. You're a South Korean, and you're born in South Korea, you're with your parents, and then over time, as you are influenced by your parents, you learn the language, you go to school, you eventually identify that, oh, I am from the South Korean culture, and you categorize yourself as a South Korean. So that's where enculturation sort of plays in with social identity theory. I don't. I think. Hmm. I don't know, but I think they would usually SAQs are specific. Explain would mainly come under ERQs. I think. I don't think explain comes under SAQs. Wait, let me check. Yeah, it's never. Okay, yeah. Explain is usually only under ERQ, so don't worry about explaining something that general in SAQs. Huh. Your teacher is. Yeah, I think the essay. Okay, so ERQ is also known as long response. I know people have different wordings for things, but usually when they say explain, it's an ERQ because that way you have more. Yes, you have permission to open your mouth, or you can type up to you. Um, okay, yeah. Yes, that's good. So, yeah, SAQs are usually very specific. They don't go that broad because you don't have enough word count to do that. Okay, so moving on. Okay, I'm glad that helped because yeah, I think over time you get used to the words and then you know how to study for the exam. Okay, so the next thing is conformity and enculturation, which is it's very similar to what we spoke about earlier, wherein it's saying changes often happen through conformity. So in the previous thing, when they're talking about individuals figure out which group they belong to, basically conformity is that passageway. I don't know if passageway is right. It's like that means of which they realize, oh, I have to be like these people. So you're changing yourself, you're acquiring the cultural norms, you're fitting in. So you're changing yourself to fit in with these people, and that is mainly enculturation because you're influenced by your parents, the people, your peers around you in that sense. But it could be a little confused with acculturation. So uh, I will explain acculturation later and you'll realize the difference. But in that sense, um, it's more to do with conformity as well. Okay, so the next one is social cognitive theory, which is uh, I don't have as much information on this personally, but there is an example of a specific study that goes into social cognitive theory and enculturation. So if you're asked on this, one study you could try is about observational learning since we learned about Bandura. And it is observing members of the same culture and they tend like it's with how your parenting style, how a child is brought up. So observing members of the same culture, they learn culturally appropriate behaviors accordingly. And one study is Otta and Rochat from 2004, where they look at how children are brought up through observational learning, so a different parenting style than, say, a Western culture, and how they learn to fish, how they learn to do specific chores just by watching their parents or the people in their culture. So that's more in terms of how social cognitive theory and enculturation tie in together and children grow up. Um, and then you also have to remember that you have to be careful if suppose you refer to Bandura in terms of enculturation, uh, that you focus on the whole idea of enculturation, but it might not be the best choice in that sense. So studies like Auden and Rochat, one of them, but you might have other studies provided by your teacher, so or in thinking or other websites, so you're free to use those. Just make sure your focus is enculturation if they ask for enculturation in the question, and not necessarily social cognitive theory. So, the next few things I mainly kept this short because we mentioned it before. So, memory thinking are also sort of tied in or affected by enculturation, and it's saying that you can use examples from cultural dimensions in terms of if you're from the individualistic culture, collectivist cultures, what they have learned. But you have to make sure you focus on enculturation in that sense. But they tie in with the cultural dimension studies, but when you talk about them, you have to go more into the whole idea of what cultures they specifically pick up. Oh, someone left. Okay. And then the next thing I will go into is acculturation. Does anyone have questions? Because enculturation and acculturation are confusing. No? Okay. I will proceed. Okay. Acculturation is basically changing of a person's behavior when you come in contact with different cultures. And like, acculturation is very emphasized on the whole idea of intergroup relations. So, an example of acculturation, I will use myself. I am Indian. I have grown up in India, and then I came to Belgium, and I went to an international school, and I was exposed to a different culture. And over time, I have adapted a bit of its norms. So, I have changed my behavior after having come here from a completely different culture. And there are many theories that kind of fall under acculturation, or more like areas that people look at, which is the framework which people have, and then the whole idea of assimilation, adaptation, and the psychological effects acculturation has. And there's connections like enculturation with social identity theory, conformity, memory, and thinking, which also tie in with acculturation. So, this is just one framework that was suggested, and it summarizes the whole acculturation thing really well, which is suggested by David Sam and John Barry. One second, I just need to check my notes. So, basically, the framework works wherein a culture, so two cultures or three, come in contact with each other, and then both cultures, or like the people from those two cultures, say, um, change to some degree, and then individuals will acculturate on a psychological level, so they will change themselves in certain ways, and then they adapt to the culture. So, if I use my example, I am an Indian. I come to a Belgian thing. There are some issues with this model, but and then I come to a different culture, and then I have behavioral changes. I acculturate new things, and then accordingly adapt psychologically. So, say I start speaking in a different accent, or I start interacting a certain way, like the cheek kisses that people give here. Um, so that's one framework, but there has been criticism about it because it's just a general explanation, but not necessarily the best. Um, and then there's also these acculturation strategies that have been come up with. So there's four kinds of acculturation that people tend to think of that came up with. So the first one is integration. So it's basically individuals maintain their heritage culture, but they interact and adopt the other culture, new culture's norms. So I come from India. I still have some of my Indian heritage, but I adapt other groups' cultures into my life and I follow their norms. So that's integration. Assimilation is basically individuals adopt norms of the new culture, but they lose their heritage or cultural identity. Now, I'm generalizing here, but for example, and one would be, say, Asian Americans or Indian Americans who live in the US were born there, so they don't necessarily have as much of their heritage culture, but rather they adopt all of these new cultures of another culture. You could argue that's enculturation, but if you're looking at two different cultures and you would abandon one culture and then you retain the new culture, that's assimilation. And then separation is where you keep your heritage culture, but you do not bother adapting to the new culture. So, um, I don't have an example for that, like a real life example that I can think of, but you could, um, but just think of you don't want to mix in with the new people, so you want to stay the way you are. And then marginalization is do not maintain their heritage culture and they do not interact with other groups of another culture. Marginalization doesn't really make that much sense, but just if you think of a Venn diagram, marginalization is like outside the Venn diagram, sort of, because it does not retain anything. Okay, and then next thing, um, what these strategies are influenced by is like if you had to use like the four box degree thing, it's influenced by like the degree to which you want to maintain your identity and heritage, and then the degree to which you want to involve yourselves with a new culture. So these four are like extremes, but on a spectrum that you had to be on. Depending on your degree, you would be on a specific spot on that spectrum. So it's not necessarily this. It's not set in stone, but it's almost like a spectrum. Okay. And then the next thing we're looking at is acculturation, assimilation, and adaptation. So one thing that I didn't mention before, so is that acculturation is a bidirectional process. So it goes both ways in theory, but as researchers have found, there often tends to be one cultural group that dominates. Um, and usually research sees that that dominant culture is larger, um, and then the other culture that's influencing it is a smaller heritage culture. So these two come into contact. So for example, the groups that they tend to think about are indigenous people, ethnocultural groups, immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. So I'm sort of an immigrant, so I'm coming from a smaller heritage culture into a bigger, say, European Western culture, for example. And then when you say adaptation, you mean you are, um, it is an indicator. So adaptations are just indicators of the fact that you've gone through psychological and sociocultural changes associated with acculturation. So my adaptation, for example, is say you change your accent, that's indicating that you have sort of acculturated into another culture. Okay. Math. Okay. Um, so the next thing is how you can observe acculturation is, for example, your affective or emotional changes, so how you're reacting to things, how you feel, behavioral changes, and cognitive changes. So, cognitive changes could be your schema and other things. And then theoretical focuses are so some of the things that people tend to look at is your stress and your coping mechanisms, which differ in different cultures and often change as you acculturate, or culture learning, or and even social identification. So how you identify yourself in as you acculturate into different cultures. So if you think about it, for example, when you're at school and there's different cliques, and over time you kind of acculturate, so you follow one specific clique and identify yourself. Oh, so much math. Okay. The so the two studies that you can think about in acculturation um is another Berry study. It's a different one, but it looks at immigrant children or immigrant youth that have grown up in a completely different culture, even though they come from another heritage culture. So Indian Americans or Asian Americans. Um, and then Nor and Zion et al. Oh, there's a typo, but they look at influence of culture on modes of thinking, which I mentioned earlier, where they think certain cultures think a certain way. And if you want to focus on acculturation with this study, you would have to focus on the idea that a lot of its participants were intermediates. So they were Asian Americans, therefore they were from an Asian heritage culture, but they were living and they have acculturated to the American culture. So if you talk about, say, Nor Zion, you have to make sure to focus on these participants because they're talking about acculturation in that sense, even though, say, the study is looking at something else. So, guys, stop integrating. This is psychology. Uh, and then Barry's model, which looks very sad or complicated, was tested by a study which I will not go too much in depth with, which is called Schwartz and Zamboanga. Um, and what they did is they used Mexican American students and tested Hispanic college students from Miami, and they wanted to see if those four acculturation strategies that Barry suggested actually work. And then they found that there was a lot of overlapping, and that a lot of times this idea of biculturalization or more of integration was prominent, and they found that it was at a spectrum. So Barry's model is not necessarily the most effective in terms of talking about acculturation. It is a good way to understanding how it works, but Schwartz, if you did an ERQ, say, on acculturation, and you used Barry's study and his model, you can counter it with Schwartz and Zamboanga or other counters that you have yourself, so that you can have a good critical argument and get points there. So, is there more? Yes, there is. Methodological issues. They're basically, in terms of acculturation, is that when studying acculturation, you are looking at different studies are using very different variables that are very hard to measure properly or effectively, like lifestyle and self esteem and other things. They are not necessarily quantifiable as easily or as effectively as, say, lab experiments or the ones wherein they're more numerical. So, in that sense, you aren't getting a good picture, and it's very difficult to talk about behavior when you quantify it that way. Um, and then there's also the fact that there's a lot of time and cost gone into this because you're looking at different cultures, and many a times studies are so narrowed down or focused on specific culture that it's hard to generalize it to a population because you're looking at many specific cultures or situations. So that was, yes, that is mine. And now the higher level section will begin. So that is Chelsea's cue to continue. Yes. Oh, yeah. Okay, one second. Wait, I can.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to continue with globalization and attitudes, identities, and behavior, or the HL section. So if you're not HL, feel free to leave this. Um, all right, so we're going to cover about how globalization may influence attitudes, identities, and behavior, the effect of interaction between local and global influences on behavior, and the methods used to study influence of globalization on behavior. So there's also another section which is the negative and positive side effects of globalization on behavior. But I didn't include it in this section because I'm going to kind of like cover the negative and positive side effects as we go through all of these sections. Okay, so the first one. Boy, these are so wordy, so mouthful. Alright, so the first one would be globalization and identity. So before we go into that, we're going to explore the definition of globalization and necessary definitions. Um, so globalization is the process of interaction and integration between people of different nations. Um, there is a lot of definitions for globalization, and it originates from economy. However, this is going to be the gist of what globalization is. And then we're going to also have to know the terms of local culture and global culture. As self-explanatory that should be, local culture is basically culture that we grew up and share the same environment in. So the culture that you learn or experience from your surroundings. And for global culture, it's the culture that we learn and adapt from other cultures. So, um, so these kind of cultures you usually don't learn from your locals, but you learn from through globalization. So these kind of cultures nowadays you can learn, for example, from social media, or for example from K-pop, and all sorts of cultural influences from um, popular things. Okay, so um, because of globalization, now most people have this thing called bicultural identity, and this bicultural identity um, means that most people nowadays have a mix of both local and global culture. So um, a lot of things can happen when people have bicultural identity. And some of these would be identity confusion and the sense of marginalization. So, according to Erickson in 1963, identity confusion is what happens when young people go through identity development. However, this identity development isn't achieved. So, um, this part, so these particular individuals do not develop and retain a particular identity, but rather gets confused of their own identity. So, a study that can support this would be a study by Ogihara and Uchida in 2014 about individualistic values, subjective well-being, and the number of close relationships in Japan and USA. Because as explained by Yoon, um, different cultures have their own different values. And as you can see in Japan and USA, Japan tends to have collective values, while the USA have individualistic values. And in addition, there's another follow up study in the same year that can be used in support of this. and it's about how cultures can be conflicting in Japan. And so what happens in Japan, according to the study, is that nowadays most workplaces are. Wait, sorry. Huh? Yeah, yeah. Sorry for that was my mom. All right, so where did I? Okay, so in Japan, most workplaces nowadays are encouraging Japanese workers to do achievements. However, um, according to this study, increased achievements that Japanese people do links with how um, people in Japan have um, less better well-being and less friends. So um, so this may have happened because of how in Japan they prioritize collectivism rather than individual achievements. However, as globalization occurs, um, there are starting to be some Western companies whose influence had brought to Japan and changed how Japanese system works. However, it doesn't. Um, it is conflicting with the initial Japanese local cultures, which causes um, this thing called identity confusion. So another one would be sense of marginalization, which I will explain further um, after explaining briefly. And basically, sense of marginalization happens in situations like delocalization. So delocalization means where most young people nowadays have a global consciousness. However, um, because they have a global consciousness to connect with other cultures, they tend to have a tendency to um, not really connect much with their locals. This this can connect back to acculturation, and this will also be explained further later. And then another thing of what happens when there's a sense of marginalization is that some people may try to escape from the sense of marginalization by creating cultures that are self-selected. So they create their own cultures that have that takes account of like mixed cultures. So a study that supports this would be a study by Marty and Appleby in 1993 about the existence of traditional strict groups. Um, so in these strict groups, due to the sense of marginalization that exists from their identity confusion, there's a tendency that these groups are traditional and strict because they reject these uncertainties due to the globalization that's happening. Right, so now we're jumping into globalization and attitude. But before that, we're going to have to um, know about a little bit more about attitude. So there are several components of attitude. The first would be the affective component. So the affective component is about people's individuals' feelings towards something or someone. And then the behavioral component means how attitude influences our behavior, while cognitive component means the individual's beliefs on a particular thing or particular person. So um, in social psychology, there's this assumption called principle of consistency. Um, in this principle or assumption, individuals are expected to be consistent in their attitudes and behavior, like like I explained before, and um, this this can affect um, our how attitude is perceived, and it's going to explain further in the theories that we're going to discuss, which is the first one would be how globalization affects social context on intergroup relations and contact hypothesis, which is about social psychology, which is about a social psychology theory before globalization happens. So the first is um, a theory by Early in 2011, and Early found that through the study that he conducted, he found that globalization is an important factor in shaping national identity and intergroup relations. So, according to early studies, there are two key reactions on globalizations, and the first one would be exclusionary exclusionary reaction. So, exclusionary reaction happens when a particular individual have a strong cultural identification. So, um, they they have they're these kind of people who usually have strong have a strong grasp about their culture and believe strongly about their culture. And these people usually have a strong negative reaction towards these cultures, these other global cultures, because they feel these global cultures as a threat to local culture, and they're scared that the global culture might threaten the local culture and cause the local culture to diminish. So an example of this would be how some people tend to have um, nationalism towards their country, and um, well, this is not in all cases, but sometimes in some cases, there are people who are highly nationalistic to the point where um, they will only speak highly of their countries and diminish other countries' potential in their cultures, and like not admit that some other cultures may be great and um, some other some of their cultures might have flaws. So for integrative reaction, um, integrative reaction is what happens when an individual have a weak cultural identification with their local culture. Uh, so these people would usually be the young people who can who can see other cultures as a potential for problem solving. So an example of this would be someone who is who has constructive patriotism. So constructive patriotism is basically someone who is patriotic to their countries, however, is still open-minded enough to receive criticisms of flaws and strengths. I am very sorry for these interruptions. All right, let's continue. So the second theory that we have is contact hypothesis. So before globalization happens, Alport proposed a hypothesis saying that um, if there's if people have positive contact with outgroups, it would improve their intergroup relationships. So basically, Alport argues that if people there are more people exposed with the groups that um, they're not in. For example, in globalization, mix of intergroups. Okay, sorry, let me rephrase that. So, for example, in globalization, there are several groups, and you get exposed to them more often. They believe that relationships between these groups would improve instead of deteriorate. However, because of globalization, now we can know and find out that according to some of these studies, the things that happen is actually the opposite of what Alpert argued in 1954. And um, after globalization, they found out that stereotypes are actually strongest or actually most prominent when cultures are in direct contact with each other. So the studies that supports these would be Chen and Chui in 2010. So in this study, um, they found that people in cities engage in more stereotyping than people who don't. Um, so they found that these cultural exposures actually support stereotyping because people know more about the different cultures that they have, and they manage to link more of their traits with their groups. And then the second study which supports this would be a study by Butchell in 2014 about how people who compare cultures are more likely to believe in stereotypes. And Grease et al. In 2011 about how contact with another group through media exposure causes more negative reactions than positive reactions. Right. So, um, as we see in enculturation and acculturation, when old cultures and new cultures interact, there is an effect. And we can also see this in globalization, where local cultures and global cultures interact, and as you can see later, it would influence behavior. So, there are some positive effects of the interaction of local and global culture. So, the first positive effect would be that people would start to create a global norm which can be acceptable in international communities. And this means that there's going to be less um, less identity crashes, and um, this means that there's going to be less identity confusion happening because there's going to be a global norm which everyone can agree on. And other positive effects which local and interaction of local and global culture have would be some other non-psychological factors, which I will not explain here because this is about psychology. But then there's also negative effects when local and global culture interact. And um, these negative effects in psychology would be marginalization. And in these two examples, you'll see why. So, according to Delafosse, Forrest, and Gobowo, I'm so sorry if I mentioned that incorrectly, in 1993, globalization may lead to negative behaviors in young adults. So, statistics found that um, um, when they do like a correlational study about negative behaviors and globalization, they found that globalization has positive correlations with higher risk of suicide, drug abuse, prostitution, and interpersonal aggression. Um, and then another negative effect that can happen would be the hikikomori, or the social isolation syndrome. So, the social isolation syndrome is when an individual, especially um, when this happens in Japan, is when an individual locks themselves in their room and refuse to come out for years. So, um, signs of these syndromes would be that this person have no motivation to participate in any kind of work, and these people have no other signs of psychological disorders, and the social withdrawal persists for at least 6 months. So, hikikomori is a prime example of what happens if people experience this identity confusion and feel rejected from the local and global culture. So, um, like the like how Yoon explained before, there's this model called Berry and Sam's acculturation model and globalization. So, in this model, um, similar to the model that she explained before, basically what happens is that if there's a positive attitude towards global culture and positive attitude toward local culture, integration would happen. But however, if there's a negative attitude and negative attitude for global culture and positive attitude for local culture, then there would be separation. So basically, um, this individual would stay in their positive attitude, but then they would separate themselves from the global culture that exists. Meanwhile, for local and meanwhile, if people um, takes in global culture positively, but has a negative attitude towards local culture, then what happens would be assimilation. So, um, I, I actually have a, my mom actually has a personal experience with a friend who experienced assimilation. So what happened was that um, this particular friend of hers moved to Hawaii, and um, she was influenced by a new culture from an old, an old culture that we had. And after moving to Hawaii, she started proclaiming that America is the best and um, started saying about how the healthcare there or the education there is free and blah blah blah, it's the best. And she started rejecting the local culture that she used to have and talked about how bad the local culture is. And that's an example of how assimilation happens. Meanwhile, marginalization is what happens when there's a negative attitude towards the global culture and a negative attitude also for the local culture. Um, and this might have happened because the individual feels like they are rejected by both the global culture and both the local culture, and they feel like they cannot confirm or relate to any of them, or feels like both of them are bad or some sort. So, when it comes to the methods to study the influence of globalization on behavior, there are some considerations that you have to take in. Um, some of them are positive and some of them are negative. So, the positive considerations of globalization is that be, thanks to globalization, um, globalization challenges sampling bias. Because in the past, before globalization was involved in psychology, um, studies tend to use samples which are wired or weird or however you say that. So basically, their samples tend to be Western, industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic. So um, as you can see here, since their samples are very tied to a certain trait, it means that most of the studies in the past might have been only might have only be able to generalize to Western or industrialized, educated, and rich countries. So, thanks to globalization, some psychologists were able to realize that it is also important to take in consideration of um, other other samples, other traits. And another consideration is a positive consideration is that it encourages the reflexivity on cultural bias because through globalization, um, comparisons of differences in culture is available. So thanks to that, we are able to know how some cultures tend to have some biases, and by doing reflexivity, on those kind of things, then the credibility and reliability of the studies can be increased, and triangulation on these studies can also be increased. Right. So, however, even with positive considerations, there's also negative considerations to consider. So, some of them would be that it is very hard to over rationalize globalization. So, the reason why it's hard is because um, it's you don't know how to measure to what extent globalization is. It Globalization is a very broad term. It's not specific. It doesn't pertain to certain behavior. It it's only like a general definition of a general phenomenon. So it's hard to over rationalize and um, measure it. And in addition, because globalization is a very broad thing, there might be too many variables to control when it comes to studying globalization, especially when you're trying to turn the study into an experimental study. Because um, these many variables have to take in a lot of things like cultural things, and then gender, and then blah blah blah, and it's going to be hard to make an experimental or laboratory study. And in addition, most of these studies up to now are mostly data from questionnaires or interview. So um, these most of these studies might be prone to biases such as leading questions bias or social desirability bias, because it's mostly based on people's personal opinions. However, there are some ways to tackle this, which is by doing more data triangulation and implementing um, well different interpretations, especially true across different cultures. Right. So ignore that slide, and that's all for today's presentation.